You know, some people just live through an era, but Victor Hugo, he was the era. This wasn't just a novelist. We're talking about a poet, a politician, an artist, and a prophet who basically became the moral conscience of 19th century France. So let's dive into the absolutely incredible life of the man who was a century all by himself.
To love is to act. These were his final words, written right before he died. And wow, is that the perfect summary of his entire existence or what? It was a life where every single word, every drawing, every political stand he took was a form of action, all aimed at changing the world. It's the principle that drove him to do everything from saving cathedrals to defying empires. So that's really the big question we're tackling here. How did one guy, a writer, manage to save a world-famous landmark, stand up to an emperor, and even predict the future? We're going to see how Victor Hugo used the sheer power of his art to do what seemed impossible, transforming from a literary rebel into the very soul of the French Republic.
Okay, so our story kicks off with Hugo as this young firebrand, really the leader of a cultural insurgency that was about to completely reshape French art and literature forever. He scribbled this in his diary when he was just 14 years old. Can you believe that? 14. And this wasn't some fleeting childhood fantasy. It was a mission statement. He saw literature and politics as two sides of the same coin, a way to become a voice that could actually shape the destiny of France.
To really get what Hugo was rebelling against, you have to understand the world he was fighting. So on one side, you had the old guard, neoclassicism, super stiff, full of rules, and totally disconnected from real life. And on the other side, you have Hugo's romanticism, which he actually called liberalism in literature. It was all about raw emotion, artistic freedom, and just embracing the beautiful, messy chaos of being human.
Now, at the very heart of his philosophy was this really radical idea he called the grotesque. Hugo argued that for art to be true, it couldn't just show the beautiful, the sublime. No, it had to embrace the ugly, the broken, even the monstrous. I mean, just think of Quasimodo. He wasn't just a character. He was a walking, breathing manifesto for this entire idea.
And when I say battle, I don't mean that metaphorically. When his play Hernani premiered in 1830, literal riots broke out inside the theater. It was the old-school classicists versus his young, rebellious romantics just going at it. And when that curtain finally fell, Hugo had won. Neoclassicism was pretty much dead, and a whole new era had just begun.
So, having conquered the literary world, Hugo turned his incredible power to shape public opinion towards a brand new target, saving the very soul of Paris, which was cast in stone.
It's hard for us to imagine now, but back in the 1820s, the Notre-Dame Cathedral was, well, it was kind of an afterthought. It was crumbling, it had been vandalized after the Revolution, and city planners were actually talking about tearing it down. It was seen as just this gloomy relic from a dark Gothic past.
So how on earth did he save it?
Well, it was an absolute masterclass in cultural activism. He started with essays, making this brilliant intellectual case for why they needed to preserve medieval architecture. But the real killing blow was his novel, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. See, he didn't just write about the cathedral, he made the cathedral the book's main character. He breathed life and soul back into its crumbling stones. And the public absolutely fell in love. The outcry was so huge it forced the government to act, which led to a massive, decades-long restoration. A single work of fiction literally saved one of the world's most iconic buildings. It's just incredible. But Hugo's battles weren't just about culture. Oh no. His political journey is one of the most dramatic transformations you can possibly imagine. It took him from the king's inner circle to becoming an outlaw on the run. His political change was just staggering. I mean, he started out as a conservative insider, a favorite of the king, but Hugo just couldn't ignore the suffering he saw on the streets of Paris. His conscience caught fire, pushing him further and further to the left. He went from being a nobleman to a champion of the poor. And it all came to a head in 1851 when he stood up against a dictator's coup and became an enemy of the state. 19 years. Let that number sink in for a moment. He was forced to flee France and spent nearly 2 decades in exile. And when the emperor, the guy Hugo famously nicknamed Napoleon the Little, offered him a pardon, he flat out refused. He declared, "I will return only when liberty returns." And you know, this wasn't some quiet period of reflection. No way. This was his most ferocious and productive era. From his little rock of exile, he unleashed these devastating poetic attacks on the empire, and, of course, wrote his masterpiece, Les Misérables, a novel that would give a voice to the voiceless for centuries to come. But while he was writing these epic works, Hugo was hiding a sort of secret identity. He was also one of the most innovative and honestly shockingly modern visual artists of his time. He produced over 4,000 drawings. And his techniques were just wild, totally out of step with his time. Get this, he painted with coffee grounds and soot. He would create these accidental ink blots, these random taches, and then he'd develop them into these haunting, abstract landscapes, a process that came decades before the Surrealists were doing anything like it. It's this whole other side to his genius. He kept most of it private, maybe because he was afraid it would overshadow his writing, but it just shows a mind that was always experimenting, always creating.
But Hugo wasn't just an architect of literature and heritage. He was an architect of the future. Long before it was even a remote political possibility, he was drawing up the blueprint for a modern, united Europe.
He said this all the way back in 1849. You have to remember, at a time when Europe was all about war and nationalism, he was talking about a shared identity, a continental brotherhood, where bullets and bombs would be replaced by votes. It was a radical idea.
And these weren't just vague dreams either. He predicted the specific ways it would work. A single currency, a great sovereign senate to settle arguments, the end of borders, and even a partnership between the United States of Europe and America. People called him a utopian dreamer, but he was really just laying the groundwork for the world we live in today.
So when Hugo finally died in 1885, after coming back to France as this living legend, his funeral wasn't just a ceremony. It was this massive, defining moment for the very Republican ideal he had fought for his entire life.
Over 2 million people. Just try to wrap your head around that number. More than 2 million ordinary citizens, workers, students, families lined the streets of Paris to follow his casket. They turned his funeral into a celebration for the oppressed people he had always championed. And this is the most powerful detail of all. The government gave him this massive state funeral. They even laid his body in state under the Arc de Triomphe. But they honored his last wish, to be carried to his grave in the hearse of the poor. It was his final, silent act of solidarity with the Misérables he gave his life to defend. You see, with Hugo, the work is never really finished. He set these impossibly high goals for all of humanity. So the final question isn't just about what he did, but what his legacy asks of us now. He dedicated his life to fighting the injustices of his century. So what would he ask us to fight in ours?